Number 290 Heavy, contact departure 119.2, good night.
119.2, 290 Heavy.
Welcome to the Aeropedia Podcast. I'm Ashwin.
And I'm Peter. We're really excited to have you on board with us today.
So the Aeropedia Podcast is an easy listening podcast focusing on a wide range of aviation topics that will appeal to avid travelers, curious minds, budding aviation enthusiasts, young professionals, even students thinking about careers in aviation, and obviously the longtime AvGeeks. In each episode, we will cover a specific topic within this exciting industry and speak to a guest about their subject matter expertise in that area. So guests will talk about the skills required along their career ladder, key topics in their cool professions, and some behind-the-scenes stories.
Each guest also will be able to compete in our exclusive Aeropedia Podcast Trivia Challenge, hoping to be crowned the next ultimate AvGeek. Our Trivia Challenge is also a fun way to learn something new about the industry. So let's dive into our topic for today. Today's topic is asset valuations. We have the pleasure of having Gueric Dechavanne with us. Gueric is the managing partner and part owner of Collateral Verifications, CVLLC, and is an ISTAT-certified senior appraiser. Gueric brings decades of expertise and experience from CIT's corporate aircraft department, Eagle Aviation, CIT Aerospace, OAG-backed Aviation Solutions. He's a graduate of Embry-Riddle and has a bachelor's degree in aviation business administration with a concentration in international air transportation management. Gueric has various publications in the valuations marketplace and is a fellow podcaster, with being co-host on the Time on Wing podcast. So Ashwin, is your seat belt fastened?
Yes, it is. It's as tight as it can be.
All right, let's go.
So today we have the privilege of having Gueric on the podcast. Gueric, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. This is great. Great to be here.
Yeah. So the first question we ask all of the guests is, can you introduce yourself and just walk us through your professional journey within the industry?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Gueric Dechavanne, and I am a managing partner at Collateral Verifications. So I've been in the industry now for almost 26 years. And I started my career, I started with, I was a kind of an analyst, I guess a sales analyst, you would call it, at CIT Equipment Finance, where I started doing like piston aircraft financing. And so I went to school at Embry-Riddle. When I graduated, I had an opportunity to go work for them in Tempe, Arizona. And I was in charge of basically just trying to grow the portfolio that they had just acquired from another bank, and which was an interesting experience. In the end, it was really more about just kind of trying to grow the portfolio. And so it was very much focused on like the smaller airplanes, like Cessna 152s, 172s, like the smaller stuff. And as part of that, my job was kind of involved working with the credit team. So I was doing appraisals internally, trying to figure out, okay, here's this person that wants to finance this airplane. What do I think our credit team is going to basically view as the value of the airplane, and how much are we going to lend against that? So that's kind of how I got my start of appraising airplanes, was kind of knowing, all right, what do I think? And I was using like Aircraft Blue Book. And so that got my toe wet into that space, looking at, ultimately what aircraft are worth. I was there for a little under a year and a half, and then I went to work for a company called Eagle Aviation, which had a corporate aircraft sales department. And my job was aircraft research. And so I researched, at that point, it was King Airs. And then I moved into more of the Cessna citations. So still, corporate jets. And, similar where, ultimately I was, tasked with finding out what aircraft are worth, and also trying to figure out, hey, what's, calling on aircraft owners and figuring out, if they're willing to buy or sell or what they were trying to do. But it involved, again, a lot of research on my end to understand what airplanes, sold for, what were the different modifications or options that would add value to an airplane. How did you view maintenance or paint or interior work and so, that I really loved that part of it, and I really kind of started to realize I enjoyed the market research part of that. My job was very much a commission-based job, and that was the part that I did not like. And I knew at that point that I wasn't really interested in sales, which is kind of where I thought I was going, was like corporate aircraft sales. I was like, oh, hey, sell an airplane, make some good money, that's great. And I just started to realize, I'm like, I really don't like that part of it. And so at that point, I had an opportunity to move back up to the Northeast, which is where I'm from. And I was looking at jobs with either CIT Aerospace or Dassault Falconjet. And they both made me offers. CIT made me a better offer, so I went to work for them, and that's how I got my start in the commercial side. Worked with the likes of Tony Diaz, Jeff Niddle. And so same thing, I was kind of a market analyst at the beginning, and my job was understanding kind of markets, dealing with appraisers in the industry at that point, trying to see where they saw the markets, where their values were. And so I worked with like the pricing team, the remarketing team, the technical team. So it was a great experience when it came to just kind of getting a sense for all of the different facets of aircraft leasing. And so I did that for about 3 years, to 2004. And within that time, again, my job was very much focused on, valuations, understanding the markets, the nuances in the markets. And I was approached at that time by a company called Back Aviation, Scott Daniels, who was looking for somebody to head up their appraisal group. I ended up kind of building a valuation model with the help of some of my colleagues. And then we also ended up doing a publication, which, kind of started to sell. And so that was kind of my kind of going into, full-time appraisal experience. At that time, I also became ISTAT certified through the ISTAT organization. That was, I was there for about 4 years. And within those 4 years, BAC was bought out twice. Because we were bought out once by Commonwealth Business Media, then by United Business Media. And the companies just kept getting bigger. They were buying us. And so they really didn't have a good understanding of the appraisal business and what I was doing. And so I became less and less significant, and I started to see that. And so in 2008, before the financial crisis, I had an opportunity to go out on my own with a couple of other business partners, and that's where collateral verifications came from. And so August of 2008 is when I started. I love every minute of it. It's a great job. And, so that's kind of my career path over the last 26 years.
So you're new to the industry is what you're saying?
Yeah. I'm
just starting out.
Just starting out. Yeah, just went behind the years, it's
the world's your oyster.
That's right.
Hey, you referenced in there the ISTAT certification. Could you maybe, for the listeners that don't know what that is, could you maybe talk a little bit about what ISTAT is and what being ISTAT certified means?
Sure. So ISTAT is an organization that was created in the 80s. It was, back in the 70s and 80s, it was kind of like the Wild West, where, people were just doing deals and, kind of back of cars with, kind of briefcases full of cash, that kind of stuff. So there was a good amount of demand, as the, you had the start of like operating leasing. So it was a bit more complex structures that were coming out. And so there was a need for a bit more standardization and consistency in the industry to be able to rely on kind of third parties to provide, valuation opinions, because a lot of the banks and investors were looking at, hey, can we know, your stuff. It's great that you're telling us that the airplane's worth X millions of dollars, but it'd be nice to get somebody else to kind of come in and justify that price for us and explain, where they're coming from, so that we feel comfortable with where we're lending on the assets. And so ISTAT was created, and over the last 40 years, I guess it's probably something like that, a little under 40 years. They also created the ISTAT appraiser group, and so ultimately the group is made of, I think we have just under 100 or so ISTAT certified appraisers. Of that, there's about 26 of us that are ISTAT certified senior appraisers. So I got involved, with wanting to be ISTAT certified just because it's a well-recognized association within the kind of the finance community, the leasing community, as well as the OEM. So anything that's commercial aviation related, ISTAT is well known for that. And so if you have a requirement for aircraft appraisals or engine appraisals or even spare parts, or there's a lot of different asset types that are covered, you kind of have that sense of reliability and credibility when it comes to ISTAT appraisals, just because we've gone through, a certain process to become ISTAT certified. And so at least you have the sense of, hey, look, these guys kind of went through the process. They've got the experience. They do a lot of things to basically stay on top of the markets. They educate on what's going on. And so we feel good that when we hire them, we're not hiring just Joe Schmo that's just kind of putting stuff on a piece of paper without really knowing what's behind it.
Wow, very interesting. So does that mean, Gueric, that anytime anybody needs a valuation on an aircraft or an engine, more often than not, they approach an ISTAT certified appraiser?
I would say on the commercial side of aviation, yes, I think the ISTAT's done a good job of kind of marketing the community as a whole. One of the things that I learned fairly early on with commercial aviation is that unlike like housing appraisals or housing markets or even shipping, there's a lack of transparency from the data side, right? So it's not like you can go in and pull up a database and figure out, oh, okay, so this many airplanes sold and this is what they sold for. You can certainly go through databases and figure out, transactions in terms of, here's what aircraft been leased or sold or transferred from one entity to another, and so the likes of CH Aviation would do a good job of that. But there is no details behind the transactions, right? That's confidential, and so with that, it's becomes a bit challenging to be able to kind of get data to do your job, right? And so as I kind of moved into doing this full time, you start to understand that it really comes down to relationships and having the ability to reach out to a variety of different sources depending on what you're working on, and having that trust on their side that when you ask them, hey, look, I'm doing an appraisal on a 2010 A320, where do you see the market? What's your take on what's going on? They give you feedback, without necessarily holding back and kind of saying, well, I don't know what you're trying to do, so I can't really share anything. And so at the end of the day, right, that's a big part of my business, is having those relationships and having that trust that, the information that I get, I kind of take in-house and use that to come up with my own opinion of values, with the understanding from their side that I'm not just going to take what they're telling me and just publish it out there for everybody to see, right? So that's one of the nuances of the things that I do every day.
Awesome. So can we take a step back and for our listeners, just explain to us what is an appraisal and how do you really do it?
Sure. So there's different levels of appraisals. That I think one of the most common ones would be a desktop appraisal. And, ultimately it's an appraisal that is, where somebody has a need for, whether it's because they're buying an airplane or they're leasing an airplane or they're selling, whether it's for auditing purposes where, every year they have to kind of show documentation from a third party that says, hey, look, we did this deal or we sold this airplane and it was within a range that kind of meets what these appraisers are saying. So we didn't ultimately sell something for way too much or way too little, right? And so it kind of justifies the business plan, what they're doing. And so, when you ask for a desktop appraisal, ultimately, what is typically provided is aircraft specifications for the airplane. And so you don't necessarily have to go out and kind of take a look at the airplane. That's kind of a separate product. But, and that's, I would say 99% of the work that I do is just on paper, where somebody will send me, either the serial number or they'll send me an actual spec sheet that will include, information about the airplane, and that would be, kind of obviously you're going to have the serial number, the registration, type of airplane, and then you start getting into, how many hours and cycles are on the airplane, what type of engines does it have, how many hours and cycles are on the engines, same thing with like the landing gear, the APU, the configuration. And so it's my job then to, depending on if somebody wants what would you call halftime appraisal or halftime valuation. And so halftime, that it's kind of the lingo that's typically used, with ISTAT appraisers, and halftime represents kind of I view it as the halfway point between any of the major maintenance events, right? So if you look at an airplane, it's ultimately looking at kind of the big components like the engines, the landing gear, APU, the airframe. And so the assumption is made that it's at kind of the halfway point between any major maintenance events. And it's kind of an industry standard amongst appraisers, amongst, the ISTAT community, because it provides some level of consistency when you start looking at, published values, or it gives you kind of that starting point to do an appraisal. And so when you ask for a desktop appraisal, you can either ask for a halftime condition appraisal, or you can ask for a maintenance adjusted appraisal, which would then take into account the actual condition and the actual times and cycles of each of the major components. And so that's a bit more involved. But if you're looking for something that is a bit more accurate when it comes to that specific airplane, right, that's kind of the way to go. And that information is typically given by either the party that is operating the airplane or the party that's buying the airplane or selling the airplane. They'll usually have a lot of that information. And so based on that, right, then I can kind of take the information that I've collected, each time I go out and I do updates. I start from kind of the halftime value as my starting point. And then based on the condition of the airplane, then I can make some adjustments to account for that. And that is then reflected in the appraisal, as well as for an ISTAT appraisal, there are, a variety of, I think there's like 10 different things that should be in an appraisal to be viewed as a desktop appraisal. And so, we make sure that in each of the reports, right, you have all the different items that need to be included in there, which would, ultimately talk about, look, here is what type of appraisal we're doing. Here is the asset that we're doing it on. Here's the party that we're doing it for. Here is what we have been asked to provide. And you also provide some of the definitions, some of the methodology behind how you do evaluation, as well as the assumptions or anything like that. And then there's typically some information about, the manufacturer, the aircraft type, as well as the market, so that you're providing kind of a well-rounded value opinion of that airplane, as well as the market that it's in.
Well, sounds complicated, right? And so I was just wondering, normally you would take some of the bigger components, like you mentioned, the engine, the APU, etc., right? Other than those big components, what are the smaller components that you're also looking at that, may have some kind of a needle moving impact on the price?
So there's different options with airplanes. And so, and that's where the relationships come in terms of, there is information that we get from like the manufacturers. There's information that we get from aircraft traders, where, that'll make some differences in terms of, if there's an airplane that is, let's say, operating in Europe, so therefore it's EASA compliant versus FAA. There's some additional equipment that is typically put on the airplane to be able to fly within Europe, so then ultimately to become EASA compliant. And so, you try to take that into account for the airplane. There are certain airplanes that'll have additional fuel tanks that'll be put on the airplane to have some additional range, like the A321, for example, or the Airbus A321. And so if you have, 1, 2, or 3, that'll add some value to the airplane based on the fact that it can go longer. There are, certain things in terms of whether you've got like a heads-up display on the airplane or not, which sometimes that can add value, sometimes it doesn't, depending on, you have to look to see for the fleet composition, how many operators actually operate with that equipment. And sometimes when it's just 1 or 2, then if you have that airplane, that could actually be a value discount, just because now all of a sudden you've got something that nobody else wants, so it doesn't really add any value to it. There's also things like the different weights of the airplane, the operating weights, whether it's the MAC takeoff weight, the zero fuel weight, right? There's different weights that the airplane can operate under. And so, there's some airplanes that can be, operating at a lower weight versus higher. And so you ultimately, you look at kind of what the fleet standard would be for that airplane. And then if you have something that's either above that or below that, right, then you would adjust for that. And there is a dollar amount that you can apply based on, kind of what somebody would pay when they're buying the airplane new. There is a dollar per kilo or a dollar per pound that they're going to pay to upgrade that weight. And then over time, as the airplane gets older, you kind of do that. You look at making that adjustment, but then you kind of do that at a discount as the aircraft ages. So there's different things like that you would try to take into account. Same thing on the engine side, you've got different thrust variants, meaning that obviously you'll have some aircraft that will fly with a lower thrust because of the environment that it's in versus higher thrust, maybe because they're operating in an environment that is a bit harsher or a bit higher altitude, so they need the extra thrust. And so that has a value component to it as well. And so, and then when you look at like wide body aircraft, you could have like crew rest, or you can have different door configurations that'll impact the value of the airplane. So at the end of the day, whatever details I'm provided, right, I try to take into account all those different things as best as I can. Sometimes you get more details, sometimes you get less. So you have to just make certain assumptions that, okay, my valuation is based on kind of this type of specification. And so that's the assumption that we're making. If you find out otherwise, obviously, then you can make, different adjustments to account for that.
That's interesting, Gueric. And you were mentioning the times mostly on the desktop and doing through analytics and asking questions and doing that. But are there times where you have to go kick the tires, if you will, or look at the airplane itself? Maybe explain a little bit more when that happens and why.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's obviously sometimes you do have the requirement where somebody says, hey, look, we also need somebody to go inspect the aircraft, as well as the documents, and the records behind the aircraft. So typically when that comes, because ultimately, to know the intricacies and the technical aspects of each airplane requires, somebody that has experience in that specific field, that has that skill. And so when tasked with that, I usually just reach out to, I've got a list of, A&P inspectors that, that have that experience, and depending on the aircraft types, right, you go to different people. And so, usually those are the guys that will kind of go out and take a look at the airplane, do an inspection. They know what they're looking for. They know what they're doing. And so they put the report together based on their findings, whether it be on the records or on the aircraft itself. And then based on that report that then they send back to me, I can take things into account and obviously kind of adjust the valuation based on that. There are some appraisers that, also have been A&P certified as well, A&P inspectors. And so they may have the ability to do that. For the most part, I think when you're dealing with kind of multi-million-dollar assets, you don't want to, kind of go out and send somebody that may or may not know what they're looking for. Because, if you miss something that is significant, right, that could be millions of dollars of impact just because you missed that. And so our job is to kind of do the best, job possible by kind of knowing what to look for. And so that's why, we typically rely on kind of technical folks that have that knowledge and experience, so that at least you don't feel like you're missing anything.
Gosh darn it, Ashwin, that means he's not going to invite us to go look at the airplane.
No, I'm trying to think. I've gone to a couple of inspections. I've done a few myself, just as part of the ISTAT certification. You do need to do an aircraft inspection, and so you typically kind of tag along with a certified A&P. But I haven't done too many. It's amazing. I think a lot of the lessors, a lot of the companies already kind of have companies that they use for that. So a lot of the times what they'll do is they'll just have somebody go out and inspect the airplane and, provide you with that report and say, hey, look, we want you to take everything into account. And so here's kind of the work that these guys have done. And so please base the appraisal on that. So unfortunately, I don't get to see a lot of airplanes all the time. But, you do get the ability to through what I do, just to kind of interact with the OEMs and different companies that, do allow you to kind of check out some airplanes every once in a while. So it you know, at least it gets you to do that.
Yeah. So the other question I had was, what would happen if you and all of the other appraisers just stopped, right? What if tomorrow there's no values of these assets, right? Who's going to miss them? What impact will it have on the industry?
That's an interesting question. I mean, if all of a sudden all the appraisal firms went away, I mean, look, I think there is definitely a need to understand the valuation of assets. And so, for anybody that is looking at, buying or leasing or financing, or, even when you start getting into, as things get older, you start parting them out. And so having that understanding, there's definitely a need for that. And, because, it's kind of not everybody can have that understanding of everything all the time, right? I mean, even if you talk to, aircraft traders or even lessors, which have a very good understanding of, the value of airplanes and what they should be worth and what they should sell for and everything like that. At the end of the day, there's still a need for a third party to come in and kind of give a sense of what if, how a third party would look at the market. And, so the basis for, kind of the halftime current market value is there is, the definition kind of looks at a more of what we call like a naked airplane, right? So it's an airplane that is supposed to be just kind of by itself. There's no lease attached to the airplane. There's no cash flow attached to it. So ultimately you're trying to define what the value of the metal is. And so, that, certainly has kind of intricacies in terms of trying to find that out. And so there is a need for that based on kind of how the market works, right? And how investors, they don't just necessarily rely on kind of the people that they invest in to tell them what things are worth. They do like to have kind of that third party involvement. So, so I think if we all went away, I mean, I'm sure somebody would figure out a way to keep business going, right? It's not like we're that important where like if we're not here, all of a sudden the industry crumbles. But I do think it would leave a big void, just because a lot of folks that will also invest in, the leasing companies or even airlines or anybody that's in the public side, right? They're looking at it from, an even higher view than, your investor that will buy an airplane on lease or just buy an airplane outright. And so they do rely on kind of also third parties like us to give them keep them informed as to what's going on and kind of let us educate them on what they should know and how each market, kind of influences the value of airplanes or engines or anything like that. So, I think there's sufficient parties out there that kind of rely on our expertise, that, we do have a pretty good need. And that's why, there's probably a dozen or so, maybe there's more. I haven't counted how many firms are out there, but there's a good amount of firms that are out there. It's not a big number, but based on the firms that are out there, right, there's sufficient demand for all of us to kind of keep busy and keep doing what we're doing. So it would be interesting if all of a sudden we all went away, but I think somebody else would just pick up the slack and start doing what we're doing.
Yeah. My question was more, what if, values didn't exist anymore, right? But I think you answered it. There would be a huge impact, directly to the valuation of an airline, for example. There would be an impact on how aircraft trading companies would transact, lessors as well. You touched on that, and I think aviation insurance companies as well rely on values of assets in order to provide insurance premiums and whatnot. Yeah, so I think, yeah, it widespread impact, big impact, in fact, to the entire transactional element of these assets, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we're, through, whether it's through kind of direct, appraisals, or whether it's through the publications that a lot of the firms, publish, or, it's like people rely on kind of our opinions based on what's going on. And so that allows them to do what they do, and feel comfortable in what they're doing. So yeah, I think not having that there would definitely create that void. And then, at some point you have to, it's a different way of valuing things, but it doesn't necessarily pick up on, I think, the nuances of how the market really works.
Nice. Yeah, it's so fascinating, Eric. And I think we can continue talking for hours on this topic, and there's so much breadth and depth here that we could explore. But we're gonna move on to the rapid fire section, and this is where I'll ask you a couple of questions just to get to know you and your experiences better.
Sure.
Um, so the first one is name one hard skill and one soft skill that you think is required to succeed in your profession.
I would say hard skill is the ability to reach out and talk to people, right? I mean, I think that, you know, the ability to communicate, it's because you have to be willing to reach out, whether it's, you know, not just through emails or, you know, to kind of get the relationships that you need. And so not everybody has that ability to, you know, to talk to people and to get to the right sources. You know, it's one thing to, I think, analyze, you know, data, but it's another to kind of know what the data means because of the fact that you've been able to talk to other people that are in the business and understand what's going on. So I think that, you know, I think being, you know, I wouldn't say necessarily an extrovert, but somebody that's, you know, that where you're able to, when you have, you know, a specific projects that requires you to reach out to different people in the industry to get answers, right? You have to have that ability. Just and just kind of sending an email and hoping for a response doesn't necessarily cut it. You know, so you have to follow up, you have to, you know, make phone calls, you have to understand. And so I think that to me is an important skill as being a researcher, so that you kind of get the full, you know, the full experience of what you need to know and who to reach out to be able to get the answers. In terms of soft skills, you know, I mean, I think, look, at having the ability to kind of, you know, model things and to calculate numbers, and, you know, if you're a math fan and you're a numbers fan, you know, that's what it takes ultimately to be an appraiser, right? You have to enjoy, you know, kind of playing with numbers and seeing what's going on. And I think that's kind of a, you know, a requirement that, you know, you would have, but it's that I would view that potentially as a soft skill, just because I think a lot of folks that are, you know, kind of in the leasing or finance or that kind of business have that understanding to begin with. But, you know, you need to kind of like doing that day in, day out.
Yeah,
So you're a spreadsheet guy.
Yeah, that's it. That's what I do all day.
Awesome.
My kids
We
come in
love
here and
spreadsheet guys.
they look at my computer screens and they're like, "What are you doing? That looks boring." Yeah, that's what I do all day. I just play with numbers.
awesome. What's your fondest aviation memory?
Honest aviation memory. You know, I will say, so I was born in France, and one of the things that I still kind of have in the back of my head is that so I lived about 20 minutes away from Charles de Gaulle Airport, and around 12 o'clock, it was like 12 or 12:15 every day, the Concorde would go from France to the US, right? And so every day you would hear the sonic boom, right? That would just kind of fly over, and you would just, and that was, I think that was pretty cool. Kind of now, looking back on it now, you kind of realize how cool that was. So I would think that was me, would be one of the more fond memories I have.
Wow, that is awesome. Oh my God. Just I wish yeah, you can't do it anymore, obviously, but yeah, I
Yeah, yeah,
wish you know, all of us AvGeeks had a chance to experience that specific moment. Yeah, pretty cool.
yeah.
So what part of aviation do you feel is misunderstood or least understood by the general public, and what can they do to learn more about that?
You know, I think there's a lot of criticism about kind of the environmental aspect of aviation. And, you know, I think it's very easy to kind of criticize and go after airlines or manufacturers or and say, look, you know, your guys are producing stuff and you're using stuff that pollutes, and you know, you've got tons of carbon emissions. But I think, you know, when you look at kind of what manufacturers do day in, day out, ultimately, you know, every year they come out with more efficient products based on the technology that's available, right? So it's not like we're not doing anything. I mean, you know, airplanes have gotten more efficient over time, you know, since aviation started. and will continue to do so. And obviously you take into account, the things that are more important in terms of environmental, whether it's noise, whether it's emissions, whether it's fuel. And so I think there is that kind of lack of understanding of, what the industry is really doing. And I think on the airline side, there's definitely a lot more that airlines are doing today that are maybe not necessarily seen in terms of, kind of reducing their carbon footprint. And that kind of has also, depending on the messages that are put out there, maybe less understood, just because people kind of view, well, you're just, you're not necessarily, you don't really care because you're still flying airplanes, right? But so I think that's the part that I think the general, public doesn't necessarily see and understand what the industry is all about, and the fact that, I think at the end of the day, people do care, and we're trying to do things. But I think it's an easy target just because we're, it's aviation is kind of in the news and in the limelight all the time. So it's kind of like, well, it's an easy target to go after. So that would be my thing.
Yeah, well said. And my last question is, tell us about your best end-to-end aviation experience, right? And I'm talking about, origin airport. Give us details about that, and then whether there was a lounge involved, and then what airline, what aircraft, where did you end up as a destination, etc. So end to end, right? This has to be hands down your favorite experience in the airline industry.
Secondary security pat downs that you enjoyed.
So I will say, I think, because it's not, I mean, obviously I fly a good amount throughout the year, but I'm not as crazy as some people that, are gone every month, twice a month, and that kind of stuff. So, but I would say one of my more memorable experiences was actually going from New York to Dublin, and I flew on Aer Lingus, and I was able to fly, I think it was in business class in the airplane, and kind of having the ability to go in and check in at their lounge. And also I remember when I landed, ultimately, like, the stewardess came up front and was like, "Oh, Mr. Dechavanne, can you please come up?" And they got me off the airplane first. They brought me ultimately through all the back doors to my next gate. And so that, it was just a very pleasant experience. You feel like you were well taken care of. So that was kind of nice. So I kind of that kind of sticks out, in my mind. Obviously there's a lot of airlines out there that do a great job. I think, a lot of the international carriers certainly have a nice product as well. So I'm sure people will have more interesting stories than me, but that was one of the more memorable ones for me.
Nice. Yeah, but very, very cool. And I think it's those kind of individualized experiences sometimes that make those legs extra special, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about the experience, right? I mean, At the end of the day, if you feel like you're being taken care of a little bit more, if you feel like a little more special, right, then it makes the experience that much more enjoyable, without necessarily feeling like, oh, I have to be in first class and I have to spend all this money to get that kind of treatments. Sometimes when they go out of their way, you kind of like, hey, that was nice, right? That was a good trip. So
yeah,
just harder to find these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. That concludes the rapid fire. Peter, what time is it?
Oh, Gueric, are you ready? This is the Aeropedia exclusive. We're going to move on to our trivia challenge, where each of our guests is going to be going through, and you're our next victim or candidate, I guess.
All right, hopefully I can
test
get
your knowledge.
The worst guesser prize will be my maybe I can get that.
All right. So for those of you that are listening in, we do have a visual component of the trivia round, so feel free to watch our YouTube channel if you'd like to see the questions that Gueric is going to be answering for us. So this is your round.
All right.
Here we go.
I'm ready.
All right. Question number 1, airplane spotting. What is or was, because they're not all in service anymore, was the visual difference between the DC-10-30 and the DC-10-40?
Oh, that is an interesting question. Off the top of my head, I don't know. I want to say landing gear, but I'm not 100% sure.
It is not. Here is a clue. The Dash 40 is on the left and the Dash 30 is on the right. So the Dash 40 had Pratt & Whitney engines, and so they had to redesign the air inlet to the engine to have a flare in it, whereas the original engine on the DC 10-30 did not require that. So you can see there's a bit of a bump in the front there, the number 2 engine. So both the Dash 30 and the Dash 40 had the center landing gear, which because of the increased gross weight. So
yeah, I told you I'm not great at this stuff.
This is all education too.
It
Often gives me a bad time that I dig deep into the trivia lore for these. So, all right, question 2: airports. This airport extended its runway in 2002 by building a bridge supported by 180 pillars over a body of water.
It's London City.
That's a good guess. That was built in a body of water, but in fact, it is Madeira Funchal Airport in Portugal.
Portugal, wow, I had no idea. That's really cool.
Built quite the structure there.
Yeah.
And because of the winds, it actually makes it a pretty difficult approach at times. So
yeah, it's amazing that somebody had the insight to do that. That's really cool.
All right. Our next question: aviation jobs. This job involves guiding aircraft safely on the ground using hand signals or driving a follow me car.
I don't know. That's a good question.
This one is an aircraft marshaller.
Marshaller, wow.
And for those of you listening in, I showed a picture of a Lamborghini, which is not your average follow me car, but it does exist. All right, IATA codes. QQ.
Wow. No idea.
All right. There are 2 of them. So there's an old one and a new one. The old one, you may remember, was Reno Air, which I thought was pretty ingenious. The QQ related to the Queens on cards because of their home base of Reno, Nevada. That's been taken over now by Alliance Airlines in Australia that now has the QQ code.
Yeah.
All right. Last question. The U.S. airline from the 1990s had one of its 737s adorned with Fox's The Simpsons, including Marge Simpson on its tail. Can you name the airline?
90s. I would have said Southwest, but that'd be my Western Pacific.
Western Pacific.
Wow.
Western Pacific Airlines. So again, for those of you who want to see a picture, take a look at our YouTube channel. They had a bunch of different logo jets, and one of them was with Fox and The Simpsons and had Marge Simpson on the back. So
very cool.
Well, thanks, Gueric, for taking a shot. I'm not going to say you'll probably be our champion, but we appreciate the contribution.
Yeah. That was definitely fun. I am terrible at these things. So luckily I know what I'm doing when it comes to aircraft values, but I don't need to know all these little nuances to do what I do. Otherwise I'd be in trouble.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Gueric, we hope you had fun, and we certainly did, and we all learned a lot. I'm sure, right? Thanks for being on the podcast. I think we'll definitely have to have you back on at some point to dig deeper in one of these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. This was definitely fun. As you can tell, I enjoy talking about what I do. So happy to do it. And hopefully those that are listening kind of enjoy, the different aspects of doing aircraft appraisals and, and help them kind of understand a little bit what we do every day. But this is great. I'm glad you guys are doing this. So thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us today, and feel free to subscribe and like our podcast at the Aeroscope Aviation channel on YouTube, or the audio version through your favorite podcast feed.
Also, give us any feedback on topics you'd like to hear or ways we can improve the podcast. Visit our Podbean site, Aeropedia avid.podbean.com. See you on the next leg of our journey.